Hello, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Hearing. I'm Brian Taylor, and our topic this week is medicines and audiology that have the potential to restore, treat, and prevent hearing loss. And with us to discuss these investigational medicines is Nawal Ouzren, CEO of Sensorion, a biotech company based in France. Nawal, welcome to This Week in Hearing. It's great to have you with us.
Hello, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we dive into this topic of investigational medicines that restore, treat, and prevent hearing loss, or at least potentially could do that, could you tell us a little bit about your extensive background in the biotech sector?
All right. Thank you, Brian. So I joined Sensorion 6 years ago, and prior that, my background was rather actually in bigger organization. So prior to joining Sensorion, I was running the rare genetic disease division for Shire. I was actually based in the US for that role. And prior to that, I was running the global hemophilia franchise for Baxter in actually Deerfield in Illinois. So I'm a chemical engineer, but my background actually started my career in the chemical industry and then in the pharma industry in manufacturing, quality operations, process development. And then I had the opportunity to become the chief of staff of the division president of Baxter Bioscience. This enabled me actually to move to the US from Switzerland, and it really changed the trajectory of my career because it was like an MBA on the job, had the opportunity to learn so much more about how to run a business, about the investors, about actually franchise strategy, and it's just opened up my horizon beyond just manufacturing.
Like I said, that's a really extensive background in this space. So it's great to have you on This Week in Hearing. Tell us a little bit more about Sensorion, and this is a really hot topic. These different types of investigational medicines. Maybe we could start with the mission and vision of Sensorion as a biotech company.
Yeah. So as you mentioned in your introductory comments, we are developing hearing loss therapeutics. And we have actually three different pillars. We would like to treat hearing loss after it happened. We would like to prevent hearing loss in situations where we know it may happen. And we would like to restore hearing with gene therapy for children who are born deaf. And we think it's very important actually to work in that therapeutic area of restoring hearing because when you look at the standard of care for the past 30 years, it has not changed tremendously. There were obviously some strong innovations when cochlear implants have been introduced, and it enabled actually people with severe and profound deafness to for children to acquire the language, or for maybe adults with residual hearing to continue to be connected to the world. But I think it's the right moment to transform that and have therapeutic options, pharmaceutical options that will enable people to keep their natural hearing for longer, or to actually restore hearing for people who are born deaf. If you think about the numbers, obviously the numbers are tremendous. You know, the WHO published a few years ago, a couple of years ago, that there are around 466 million people suffering from hearing loss, and we expect that number, unfortunately, to continue to increase. That's really due to the way we live. We live in very noisy environments, and unfortunately, this just accelerates the hearing loss for everybody: teenagers, children, young adults, the elderly.
Well, that's a very ambitious vision that you have. I wanted to ask you a question about and people that are viewing this can go onto your website and learn a lot more about some of the things that you're investigating. But if you could tell us a little bit more about the drug that you've developed to prevent and treat sudden hearing loss.
Yeah. So that's actually our most advanced therapeutic. It is called Sensorion. So that's the name of the drug. And as you mentioned, it has been investigated in a phase 2 clinical trial. So it means we treated patients and we compared them to a placebo arm. And sudden sensorineural hearing loss is actually a very scary disorder. People become deaf within 72 hours. And in 60% of the cases, it is irreversible. And what we try to do with our drug is actually to enrolled the patients in our clinical study within 72 hours, 96 hours after the onset of the sudden deafness, and we treated them for 1 month. And we looked at the hearing performance 1 month after treatment and 3 months after treatment. And what we have showed is that 3 months after treatment, there was actually a clinically significant difference compared to the placebo arm. And in particular, for patients who actually suffered from very severe deafness at the baseline entry of the clinical study, they had 50% of them had normal hearing at the end of the clinical study. So that was like day and night for these patients.
That's pretty impressive. You mentioned the phase 2 clinical trials. Could you tell us what status those trials are in right now?
Yeah. So that was actually the treatment trial. After that, we wanted to continue to investigate the potential of the drug, and in particular in what we call prevention setting. And currently there are 2 phase 2s, proof of concept, running in patients. One is actually in collaboration with Cochlear. I don't know if you're familiar, but Cochlear is an Australian company. They are the global market leader for cochlear implants. And the idea here was to develop a drug device trial focused on adult patients who have residual hearing, and to see if the drug would help preserve some of the residual hearing of the patients after the surgery. We have disclosed some preliminary data actually in July, where we showed that there is a 20 decibel difference between actually the patients who were treated with Sensorion compared to the patients who just received the cochlear implant without the drug. So these were preliminary. The study is still ongoing. We expect actually to release the data first half of next year. So that's the first clinical trial in prevention. The second prevention trial is actually focused on adult patients who are suffering from cancer and who are being treated with chemotherapy. And around 60% of these adult patients who are treated with chemotherapy, they will suffer hearing loss at the end of the chemotherapy cycle. So the idea here is to help the patients who are treated with chemotherapy with Sensorion to see if hopefully we can save these patients and also preserve their hearing so that they can live their life, to the fullest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And without getting too technical here, could you maybe share a little bit, and maybe if you want to direct people to your website, that's fine, but could you tell us a little bit about how the drug you're developing helps preserve hearing after cochlear implant surgery?
Yeah. So the inner ear is a beautiful organ. It's very small, very fragile, and we have a very limited number of sensory hair cells. We have only 3,500, inner hair cells, 1,200 outer hair cells. So cochlear implants is actually introducing in the inner ear, and then it's being stimulated around 20 to 22 distinct frequencies, and this will help, with the hearing outcomes. So these sensory hair cells, unfortunately, they do not regenerate. So once we lose them, we lose the function. So you can imagine drilling, during the surgery to introduce an electrode. So drilling will cause actually some maybe noise-induced hearing loss. Then the introduction of the electrode will potentially create some mechanical damage, probably some inflammation, probably some death of the sensory hair cells. And then once it's being stimulated with the current, probably some fibrosis. So all of this is very well known. So Sensorion is a anti-apoptotic. What we have shown in our animal models and in our preclinical models is that it stops actually the process of the sensory hair cell death. And so that's the purpose of Sensorion, and for that specific biological mechanism that is being triggered when you introduce the electrode, we can help with the preservation of some of the residual hearing.
That's fantastic. Unbelievable what is in store for all of us in the future. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the gene therapies that you're developing. Tell us a little bit of how they work and who the target population for those treatments might be.
Yeah, I'm going to start with a little bit of history. So in 2019, we thought it was very important to start thinking about children who are born with genetic disorders that will lead to congenital deafness. And one of the top academic institutions driving the science of hearing is Institut Pasteur, which is actually here based in France. So it was very important for me to get connected to that very prestigious, academic institution, first to show them what we were doing with Sensorion, but also to get educated on the work they were doing on gene therapy. So all of that ended up in the structuring of a very important collaboration between Institut Pasteur and Sensorion. And Institut Pasteur, they were the first one who identified actually the genes that were causing deafness, but they did not stop there. They started developing some options for gene therapies. So we licensed some of their gene therapies internally, and we are developing them for FDA, IND approval, and CT approval in Europe and in the UK. Mm-hmm. So the first indication that we started working with Institut Pasteur is called actually the restoration of ototoxicity. So there are some babies who are born because of a DFN-benign defective gene, and because of that, they don't express a very important protein called ototoxicity in their inner hair cells. So it's like they have a frozen auditory system. Nothing happens. So what we do with gene therapy is like you restore the good copy of the gene. And what we have seen in the animal model is that the animals start re-expressing the ototoxicity. And it's like all of a sudden the auditory system is live again. And we see the natural restoration of hearing across all frequencies. So there are around 20,000 children with ototoxicity deficiency in the US and in Europe. It is probably underestimated, right? Because today there is no systematic genotyping to identify the gene causing the deafness. And there are around 1,100 new babies born every single year in the US and in Europe with that ototoxicity deficiency. So where we are today, we have filed our clinical trial application in Europe and in the UK. And after that, we will go to the US. So that's the first program. Mm-hmm. And the second program that I call the Holy Grail, this is actually focused on the GJB2 gene. And why I call it the Holy Grail is because it's the biggest cause for congenital deafness in the world. That 50% of the kids who are born deaf, it's because of that defective GJB2 gene. What's very interesting about that gene also, Brian, is that beyond the fact that it's the cause of 50% of deafness at birth, it's also responsible for two other types of hearing loss, progressive hearing loss. The first one is actually children losing their hearing during their childhood, again, because of GJB2. And the second one, which was an insight from Institut Pasteur, they were particularly interested in actually young adults who start losing their hearing by the age of 30 and who become completely deaf by the age of 50. And when they genotyped them compared to the normal population, they found a specific GJB2 mutation that was causing this early onset of presbycusis. So we are also interested in actually caring for these patients, because you can imagine, you're 30, you had your hearing, you're at the top of your life at that moment, you have a career, you have a family, etc., and all of a sudden you can't hear anymore. It triggers actually some difficulties that are even bigger compared to a child who was born deaf.
That's really fascinating, and we all look forward to seeing these kinds of therapies being used in the clinic in the not too distant future. Yep. Which brings me to the final question that I want to ask you, and that is, how do you see some of these therapies that your company is creating that treat, prevent, and restore hearing loss? How do you see them standing side by side with more traditional therapeutic approaches in an ENT or an audiology clinic?
Yeah, it's a very good question, actually, because here it's about the future. Like, how do we see the future and the standard of care being evolved. So I'm going to paint, I would say, my best case scenario, obviously, with the therapeutic option. So let's focus about the sudden deafness. So today, if you look at the patient journey, so for these patients who are actually losing their hearing over, in 72 hours, what they do most of the time is that they will go see the general practitioner. And for the people who are actually more scared, they will go immediately to the emergency room. So here, as you said, there are two touching points. The first one is like the GP. So in a world where you have an approved drug that is safe and efficacious, hopefully the general practitioners will be educated enough to prescribe it, or maybe even to refer to the ENT in the city, the local ENT, who could prescribe the drug. The second option is like the patients who will end up in the emergency room and who will see the ENT at the hospital. Then at this stage, the hospital, the ENT at the hospital could prescribe it. So that would be ideally for me first-line treatment. Obviously, if it doesn't work, if some patients are non-responders, then it could be the traditional pathway, maybe explore hearing aids depending on the severity, and for really the ones who are more severe than cochlear implants. If you think about the prevention, so the patients with cochlear implants who will receive a cochlear implant, or the patients with the cisplatin treatment. So let's first focus on the cochlear implant. So in this case, the patient is received by an audiologist or ENT surgeon who will, speak about the different options. And obviously, if the doctor and the patient think that cochlear implant is a good option, if the drug is being approved and being safe, I can see a world where they would prescribe to the patient to take that drug 1 week before the cochlear implant surgery, and then follow up for 1 month, 2 months, depending on the clinical study.
Right.
So for me, that would become standard of care. If you preserve the residual hearing, the drug is being safe. For me, that would be concomitant. The patients who suffer from cancer, the ideal case is that the oncologists, when they're working with their cross-functional team, so they have ENT surgeons, obviously, etc. As part of the protocol, they would also prescribe Sensorion, again, to be prescribed throughout the chemotherapy cycle to preserve the hearing. So that's for the drug. And then for gene therapy, obviously, in this case, the patient journey, so there are newborn screening, and then we will see if the baby is having actually hearing loss issues. If there is hearing loss issues, then what we would recommend, and it's not done in every country, is to immediately genotype the child. And if the child is actually identified with one of the genetic mutation where gene therapy could be an option, then there will be a conversation between the doctor and the parents about the therapeutic options. One option is gene therapy, the other option is cochlear implant. The challenge is that if the parents choose cochlear implants, you can't treat the child afterwards with gene therapy because of the challenges I mentioned, the fibrosis, the apoptosis, the introduction of the electrode. But the other way around is possible. You could start with gene therapy, and if it doesn't work, you can still have cochlear implant as a
right down the road, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's a lot for our listeners and our viewers to think about. Very exciting times. I'm with Nawal Ouzren, CEO of Sensorion. Nawal, if people want to learn more about your company, some of the studies that you've been undertaking, how can they learn more?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources on our website, sensorion.com. As you said, there are actually a lot of material where we're showing some of the data, where we have actually interviews from doctors, independent doctors, where they can see the sites, the different clinical sites where we are working, if people are curious. We are also very open to receive emails, and that we can refer them to KOLs we know in the US, in Canada, whatever the country, if parents are actually exploring their options and they're looking for different type of information. Patient advocacy group, as I said, different ENT centers of excellence across the different countries. But the best way to start is either to go on the website, and we have actually a contact folder so people can contact us, or they can send us an email directly. We receive actually every week almost like emails from different patients who are looking for resources.
I can imagine. Oh, that's great. Well, thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to maybe having you on the on our broadcast down the road after you've gotten a few more clinical trials under your belt.
Well, I'm really grateful, Brian, for the opportunity, and have a good day, everyone.